Our first opening general session speaker is Chancellor Admiral William H. McRaven, a retired U.S. Navy four-star admiral and leader of one of the nation's largest and most respected systems of higher education, the University of Texas. Since he became Chancellor in January 2015, Admiral McRaven has recommitted the UT system and its institutions to improving the lives of Texans and people all over the world through education, research, and healthcare. In his previous life, Admiral McRaven was the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. He led a force of 69,000 men and women and was responsible for conducting counterterrorism operations worldwide. As I was going through my introductory comments last night, my husband, a former Vietnam-era Navy submariner, was most impressed by Admiral McRaven's status as bullfrog. And I'll leave it up to the Admiral to clarify that. Admiral McRaven is also recognized national authority on foreign policy and has advised Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, as well as other U.S. leaders on defense issues. His book, Special Ops, Case Studies on Special Operations Warfare, Theory and Practice, has been published in several languages and is considered a fundamental text on special operations strategy. Admiral McRaven has been recognized for his leadership numerous times by national and international publications and organizations. In 2011, he was the first runner-up for Time Magazine's Person of the Year and was named Texan of the Year by the Dallas Morning News. In 2012, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the nation's top 10 foreign policy experts and one of the top 100 global thinkers. In 2014, Politico magazine named Admiral McRaven one of the Politico 50, citing his leadership as instrumental in cutting through Washington bureaucracy, which, as we all know, is not an easy task. Chancellor Admiral McRaven graduated from the University of Texas in Austin in 1977 with a degree in journalism and received his master's degree from the Naval Postgraduate School in 1991. In 2012, the Texas Exes honored him with a Distinguished Alumni Award. And now it is my pleasure and honor to welcome our first opening general speaker, Chancellor Admiral William H. McRaven.
Thank you. Thank you very much. For the comms folks back there, I'm going to go straight with the podium mic. Well, first, Karen, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And this afternoon, just to let you know, I'm really not going to talk a lot about the University of Texas healthcare system because, frankly, we've got too many docs from UT here. I'm really going to kind of focus more on the tactical side. But let me start off by telling you that my mother, God rest her soul, would be thrilled to see me standing in front of a group of doctors and caretakers. My mother always wanted me to be a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor. He had served in both World War I and World War II, graduated from medical school in 1910, and of course so was old enough to make World War I, and then as World War II rolled around, he was still young enough to make World War II. My great-grandfather was one of the first docs in that generation to actually graduate from medical school. As most of you know, back then, all you had to do really was kind of put out a shingle in order to be a doctor. So she always wanted me to be a doctor, but unfortunately, neither my aptitude for science nor my attitude for studying so hard was going to ever let me be a doctor. So I followed my father's footsteps and went into the military. And I think both my mother and my father would be very surprised by my good fortune in life. But while my mother's dreams of a physician's son were dashed, I can tell you that my career in the military has intertwined with the medical profession time and time again, particularly during the post-9/11 years as America's been at war. I have had a front row seat to the bravery and the courage of our great combat surgeons, our docs, our nurses, our medics, our corpsmen, and it has been absolutely spectacular. I have seen miracles. I saw a man, a great SEAL I knew named Mike Day, who had been shot 27 times. 27 times, and he essentially walked away from it and is today a motivational speaker and talks about how he survived not only the initial shots, but addiction afterwards and a lot of other issues. And I've seen an awful lot of heartbreak. Breathtaking advances and frankly, in some cases, profound frustration. And today what I'd like to do is share some of what I've seen, some of the lessons we've learned over the past 16 years of fighting, and how I think some of those lessons would apply to the work that many of you are doing today. So let me start off by talking about a unit with whom I have worked very, very closely, the 75th Ranger Regiment. We have a couple of Rangers in the audience with us today. And as they well know, the Ranger motto is, Rangers lead the way. Rangers lead the way. And that certainly was true with respect to the battlefield trauma care. The Rangers are one of the most elite fighting units in the world. To say that the work they do is dangerous would be really the height of understatement. Airborne assaults, jumping out of airplanes and into the fight, infiltrations behind enemy lines, hostage rescues, urban raids on high-value targets. On a typical mission, providing care to a fellow Ranger who is wounded is very difficult. Among other challenges, you may be operating in extreme weather at high altitudes. It is likely dark outside because most of the missions the Rangers run are at night. You are far from any kind of military or medical facility. I know, by the way, the bad guys are generally shooting at you. Nevertheless, Rangers must overcome these challenges because 9 out of 10 combat-related deaths that are potentially preventable happen before a casualty gets to the care of a surgeon. 9 out of 10 combat-related deaths are preventable before they get to the care of a surgeon. Now, given the nature and the tempo of the Rangers' work, casualties are inevitable. It's a fact of war. And yet the 75th Ranger Regiment has achieved the lowest incident of preventable deaths ever documented in a combat unit. Let me repeat that. The lowest incident of preventable deaths ever in a combat unit. So how is that possible? Well, it's possible because nearly 20 years ago, a young colonel, the Ranger Regimental Commander, named Stan McChrystal, issued a directive. Acting on the advice of his superb Ranger medical personnel, he made caring for the Rangers wounded in combat one of his big 4 priorities. He said, first, as Rangers, we need to be able to shoot, so marksmanship was one of them. Physical training, obviously as a Ranger, you're humping up and down mountains, it's long patrols. Physical training was next. Small unit tactics and medical readiness. One of the big 4. Every Ranger was going to have to be an expert marksman, physically fit, understand small unit tactics, and have the medical readiness necessary to take care of their comrades in the field. It was understood from that point on that every Ranger was going to be engaged in casualty care. So every Ranger received training in Tactical Combat Casualty Care, or TC3. As a result, the Rangers achieved the lowest incident of preventable death in their wounded members in the history of modern warfare. Now, TC3, what is it? Well, TC3 is a set of evidence-based, best practice, pre-hospital trauma care guidelines customized for use on the battlefield. Continuously updated over the last decade and a half, they are a profound departure from both traditional military and civilian pre-hospital care practices. TC3 was developed in the mid-90s by Special Operations Medicine with a great assist from the Uniformed Services University, our country's military medical school. TC3 was innovative, it was different, and it was ahead of its time. And because it was ahead of its time, unfortunately, it was slow to be adopted by the military in the years before Iraq and Afghanistan. Use of TC3 was initially limited to just the Rangers, some Navy SEALs, and a few other elite military units. But it has now become the standard throughout the U.S. military as well as many of our allies. The goal of TC3 is to provide all operators, essentially all soldiers within that unit, medical and non-medical personnel with the skill needed to save lives on the battlefield when their teammates are wounded, and to do so under fire if necessary. So what makes TC3 so different, and why does it work so much better than the old approach? Well, before I get to that, I need to take you back to 2004. The war in Afghanistan was well underway, and we were losing a lot of young men and women on the battlefield. Captain Frank Butler, former Navy SEAL, ophthalmologist, was the command surgeon at the U.S. Special Operations Command at the time. And he had 2 critically important questions he wanted answered. First, specifically, what were our special operations operators dying of? What were those combat casualties that were taking lives? And second, what, if anything, could be done to prevent those deaths? Now, one might reasonably assume that the Department of Defense has always performed preventable death reviews on its combat fatalities. But unfortunately, as of 2004, there were no formal processes to review our combat deaths. Frank Butler called on a young colonel named John Holcomb, the commander of the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research, to help answer those questions. Many of you may know John is now working at Memorial Hermann. This Army laboratory is quite possibly the finest battlefield trauma care research facility in the world. And I'm pleased to note, of course, that it's just down the road from us in San Antonio. What we learned once the study was performed was frankly beyond disturbing. Simply put, we learned that a lot of special operators had died from preventable deaths. And some of those deaths might have been prevented with very simple TC3 measures, like a tourniquet. Seems a little unthinkable. Special operators, America's best warriors, getting shot in the arm or the leg and bleeding to death. But it was happening over and over. U.S. Special Operations Command, and soon after, the entire U.S. military realized that we needed a dramatic departure from our traditional methods of caring for our combat wounded. TC3 was that departure. The most important, and to some, the most controversial thing we started doing differently was to immediately start using tourniquets to stop extremity bleeding. Now, the use of extremity tourniquets undoubtedly has been the most effective, life-saving change in pre-hospital combat casualty care in the 40 years since I joined the military, and maybe ever. And yet, as I'm sure you all know, tourniquets aren't something new. They've been around for at least 4 centuries, but have until recently been completely anathema to the worlds of both military and civilian medicine. Thanks to TC3, the military has done a 180 on tourniquets, and a sea change has begun in the civilian world as well. If you can put yourself in the place of a young Army Ranger coming to the aid of a bleeding comrade, it's hard to hold pressure on a wound while you're being shot at. It's even more difficult to return fire while applying pressure. You also can't apply pressure while moving the casualty out of the line of fire. And you can't take care of another casualty while you are holding that direct pressure. Tourniquets, the simple tourniquet, changed that equation dramatically. Along with hemostatic dressings, another TC3 initiative, tourniquets have helped prevent hundreds, if not thousands, of warriors from bleeding to death on the battlefield. Now, I know some doctors still believe that tourniquets aren't worth the risk of tissue damage, but that notion is easily dispelled by both the routine use of tourniquets during orthopedic surgery, by the fact that the U.S. military put on many, many thousands of tourniquets in Iraq and Afghanistan without causing any loss of limbs. And most importantly, by the countless men and women who are alive and well today because a tourniquet quickly and decisively stopped a hemorrhage that might have cost that life. Still, on the topic of blood, another way we have completely changed our approach to trauma relates to the way we resuscitate a casualty who has gone into shock, another part of TC3. As with tourniquets, the idea isn't novel. But as we all know, even the most common sense solution to a problem sometimes has to overcome the power of habit. For many years, the way we did things was to replace the blood spilling out of people's body with crystalloid fluid. Crystalloid is inexpensive, easy to make, and it's become a tradition. But we have learned that whenever possible, someone who is bleeding blood ought to be given blood to replace it. Whole blood, preferably, not just red cells. Studies, again, from the Army Institute of Surgical Research have shown that transfusing whole blood helps us to save even more of our casualties' lives. And the sooner you get this life-saving blood, the better. TC3 recommends giving whole blood as the best way to treat shock on the battlefield, and blood products are now routinely given during casualty evacuations before they reach the hospital. Pre-hospital blood products are now starting to be used in some parts of the U.S. civilian sector as well. Here in Houston, for example, if you are a trauma patient in shock and get picked up by the UT EMS system, you will get pre-hospital blood products, thanks to John Holcomb. In the military, we revere tradition, but outdated tradition can cost lives and cause pain to survivors. Hard as it is to believe, the U.S. military was, until recently, using the same primary medication for battlefield pain relief that it did 150 years ago. Tactically speaking, intramuscular morphine makes sense up to a point. Intramuscular morphine is fast and easy to administer, but slower to work. While intravenous pain medications work faster, starting an IV on the battlefield takes time and is often impractical, especially at night. I remember as a young Navy SEAL, we all had to learn basic battlefield trauma and how to deal with patients, and we were always giving IVs. It was the first thing you learned as a young ensign, first thing you learned as a young seaman recruit SEAL was how to give an IV in all matters of weather, day and night, etc. Plus, opioids like morphine can kill someone who has gone into shock, as we found out during World War II. At the start of the war in Afghanistan, however, the military was still using intramuscular morphine almost exclusively. But a plan developed by Special Operations docs came up with an alternative, what TC3 now calls the triple option analgesic plan. Without going into great detail, the first breakthrough is a fentanyl lozenge that gives you the rapid pain relief of a strong narcotic without having to start an IV. The lozenge goes between your cheek and your gum and works within just a few minutes. The second breakthrough is the addition of a low-dose ketamine to the medic's analgesic options. It treats pain just as well as narcotics and is much safer to use for casualties at risk of shock. This pain relief, it doesn't cause a drop in blood pressure. The new approach to pre-hospital pain management has swept through the military and was reflected last year in a new policy statement by the American College of Emergency Physicians. In the last decade and a half, we have profoundly changed, profoundly improved the way we deliver trauma care on the fields of war. Death by extremity hemorrhage has dropped by 2/3. All units that have trained all their members in TC3's best practices have documented the lowest incident of preventable deaths in the history of modern warfare. The statistics paint a very, very good picture. But the difference between knowing the stats and knowing the men and women who make up those stats is the letters you don't have to write to the families. That's part of what it means to me. But what does any of this mean to all of you? There's an old quote, you've heard it before, that says that the only winner in war is medicine. And as some of you probably know, there are multiple efforts to translate the hard-won lessons of the post-9/11 conflicts into better trauma care in the civilian sector. The Hartford Consensus is an ongoing study effort by the American College of Surgeons to determine what can be done to save lives in a mass shooting or a terrorist attack. And I know that the TMA, that this particular seminar, I've had a chance to get out and see how you're dealing with mass casualties. I think anything we can do to take the work that's been learned on the battlefield and translate that to the civilian world would be well worth the effort. And the relevance of the military success with tourniquets and hemostatic dressings was immediately apparent. And the Hartford Consensus team concluded that if we want to save more people in the event of an attack, we need life-saving, external, hemorrhage control tools and techniques at the scenes. Just so as AEDs have empowered the lay public to respond to heart attacks, the Hartford Consensus recommends that easily applied tourniquets and hemostatic dressings become just as ubiquitous. The same goes for a White House program called Stop the Bleeding. Recognizing that controlling severe bleeding, external bleeding, is something that everyone can do. This initiative hopes to make Stop the Bleeding kits with tourniquets and hemostatic gauze available at airports, train stations, stadiums, you name it. And just as every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine learned to use them, the White House wants every American to be trained and ready to stop the bleeding at a moment's notice. Imagine the lives saved when that skill becomes as widespread as CPR or the Heimlich maneuver. Our nation's military men and women count on military medicine to provide them with the best possible care if they are wounded on the battlefield. And we must live up to that trust every single day. In the civilian sector, that nation's trust rests in our trauma care systems. And we can live up to that trust by constantly searching for ways to improve trauma care and by saving as many as possible of those 30,000 injured Americans who die from preventable deaths each year. Let me leave you with a shocking statistic and maybe two final thoughts. During the war in Vietnam, an estimated 3,400 U.S. troops bled to death from injuries to their upper and lower extremities. 3,400 young Americans who, because the military was guided by tradition rather than an ongoing process of continuous improvement in trauma care, died preventable deaths. That's shocking. But what's more shocking is that between the end of Vietnam and the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, nothing changed. The papers have been written, the evidence was there for all to see, but nobody stepped forward, asked hard questions, demanded answers, or drove change. The point being, we absolutely need well-designated clinical research to guide medical practice. But new evidence alone will not drive advances in trauma care. We need strong leaders and a concerted determination to keep getting better at caring for the injured to make these advances happen. I want to tell one final story and go off script here just a minute. I talked about the fact that my mother always wanted me to be a doctor, and I wasn't really sure why. She knew I probably didn't have the aptitude to be a doctor, but in my ensuing 37 years in the military, I spent a lot of time in combat hospitals. And there was one time in particular that will forever be kind of embedded in my memory. It was 2009, and we had had 2 young SEALs had been shot. And I got the call from my command center that they were coming by medevac to our combat hospital in Afghanistan. And the hospital was essentially a couple hundred yards from my command center. So I make my way over to the hospital, and just as the 2 casualties are being wheeled into the hospital in the OR, and there's a young Army major who is the trauma surgeon on duty. And they quickly triaged the 2 men. We only had 1 surgeon on duty at the time. They realized that one was more serious than the other. So we immediately go into the operating room, and I'm in the operating room, and the doc, the major, is in there. He's got a battle-hardened nurse with him. 2 young female corpsmen or medics are in there as well. And the doc, they immediately strip this young man down. He's laid bare on the table, and the doc opens up his chest and is trying to stop the bleeding. And soon into the effort, the 2 young ladies, who are probably no more than 19 or 20 years old, they just break down from having to watch this the SEAL get broken open, blood everywhere, and they break down and they walk outside. And the grizzled old nurse, who I always thought of as Hot Lips Houlihan, she was kind of one of these ones, been in battle. She went outside, grabbed those 2 young ladies, said, "You got a job to do, get back in here." And to the young ladies' credit, they came back in. Unfortunately, we couldn't save that young man. The doc and I moved to the next OR, where the other SEAL has been shot as well. Unfortunately, while we wear bulletproof vests, the seam between the front plate and the back plate, a 7.62 round had hit both these guys, different on the same mission, but kind of different locations on the mission. And a 7.62 is a pretty big round. It's like 30-06 round, and it cut right through these guys. We go into the second OR, and the young doc again cracks this kid open, trying to stop the bleeding, but unsuccessful there. And I remember the scene as the floor is covered in blood, and the team has tried all that it can, and the doc leans up against the wall after about 45 minutes trying to save these 2 guys. He leans up against the wall, slides down on the floor, and weeps. That was when I knew And that was when I knew my mother wanted me to be a doctor, why she wanted me to be a doctor. So today, as you look at the opportunity to take care of anybody out there, first let me thank you for the hard work that got you here, your patience, your drive, your care for those under the knife, under the anesthesia, under the covers, for your compassion, for all that you do for the patients in Texas and around the world. Please know that those of us that don't wear the white coats appreciate everything you do every single day. Thank you very much. I know this is going to continue to be a great symposium. David, thank you for the invitation today. Karen, thank you for the great introduction. Again, my deepest esteem for everything you do. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have some time to take a few questions if you have some. If they are hard medical questions, I have the doc sitting here. Jim, you can come up and help answer these questions for me.
Over here, Admiral.
I have the command surgeon from 3 Corps that is here today, so he can answer the hard TC3 questions, but I am happy to take any other questions you might have. Yes, sir.
David Tischer, orthopedic surgeon, on behalf of over 50,000 physicians who serve 28 million Texans, thank you for your service. Thank you for that message. You've honored us in so many ways today. I was the president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons when Haiti disaster struck January 2010. You'll recall that the hope and the comfort are regular dispensed by the United States Navy. It comes out of USAID, right, which is stuck in the Secretary of State office, and then they tell the Secretary of Defense get that ship down there. And Aristide did not want any military personnel on Haitian soil. Right. They immediately called us and said, we need 10 orthopedic trauma surgeons. We've got all kinds of limbs that are crushed. Very difficult situation, wanting memorandums of understanding, indemnity. Yep. You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
We immediately tried to supply 10. We got them 10. They all had to be volunteers. It was a messy situation. It didn't go well. We started a program to try to pre-train our civilians, just like the pre-training, right, of your military uniformed colleagues before they went to OIF and OEF. We've got a program in place. We got the CCQuas, which is the credentialing system, so that we were able to actually pre-credential civilians in a military system, and then the DOD shut us down. And we're at an impasse. We need some help, so I'm going to give you a card, and I'm asking for some help with DOD, Department of State. We're going to have another disaster that America, yep, and our Navy and our uniformed service will be asked to participate in overseas. We want to respond. We want to be helpful. But even more importantly, you brought up the whole thing about civilian disaster. We have to get prepared.
Yeah, thanks very much. I actually had Vice Admiral Rocky Bono, who is the head of Defense Health now. So we have a Navy 3-star who is in charge of Defense Health. Now, this is, I think Rocky will be able to do some great things, but we still have these kind of stovepipe with the Surgeons General, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force in terms of making sure we can pull together collectively, you know, a plan for moving forward. But anytime, and I know the Surgeons Generals want to get past the bureaucracy. I mean, again, they are docs. They want to do right by the patients. We sometimes do get stymied by the bureaucracy. And I think we can use all the help we can to figure out how do you forego that? How do you assume the risk? I mean, this is what it always comes down to. You know, when you start talking about, you know, we got to sign this MOU, we got to do this. It's all about who's going to accept the liability and the risk. Somehow we've got to work with the docs the same way, frankly, we do with the soldiers. You know, there are times in conflict when the soldiers make mistakes and people die. And obviously, if it was an accidental mistake, the soldier's not held accountable. We've got to figure out how to put ourselves in a position to provide the best care, the quickest means possible, without having to go through all the red tape. And I think Rocky Bono can help with that. So by all means, please leave me your contact. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Jason Turk. I'm a pediatrician from North Texas. Really appreciate your sincere remarks. My question is about how you learn as a culture from the experience of knowing something that you knew decades ago, but not bringing it to the front line in a timely fashion. How do you change culture to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I tell you, this is terrible to say, but war allowed us to do that. And I go back to this discussion about Doc Frank Butler, who, again, a number of the folks here in the audience know. When Frank had Special Operations Command, he actually went back and studied all of the casualties in Vietnam, and this is where we get these statistics from. And of course, the simple tourniquet was one of these ones that was you know, you talk to the docs on one side of the aisle or the other, and they had different opinions on the use of tourniquets. But Frank said, hey, look, we need to move forward with this. We beta tested it with the SEALs and the Rangers, the Delta Force, but when 9/11 happened, we said, look, you know, we were losing a lot of guys initially in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so we moved to this because we had to. And unfortunately, you would like to think you don't have to have a war to drive the change. But the reality of the matter is that's exactly what we had to do. You know, again, medicine always wins in war, and we'll be better the next time. But the kind of classic golden hour, as the docs will tell you, no kidding, and I remember Frank used to tell me this when he went back and looked at these studies. He said, as long as they are absolutely not going to die, if they didn't take a round in the head or a round in the heart, and they are savable, if we can get them to a combat hospital, you know, with a surgeon in that golden hour, their chance of survival is above 90%. That's pretty remarkable. And when you see the corpsmen and the medics that we are training today, and certainly in the special operations arena, we have a program that goes through Fort Bragg, used to go through Fort Sam Houston. I mean, these corpsmen and these medics are remarkable in trauma care. I mean, they are light years ahead of where we were in Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. So we're doing a great job. But again, the war drove that. You know, hopefully we don't have to have a mass casualty. So again, when you start looking at mass casualties, we'll get better after the next mass casualty. We don't want to wait till the next mass casualty. We got to figure this out now, and people have to accept what our options are, I think. Yes, sir.
Yes, excuse me, Dennis Postle, a palliative care doc from Austin and former hospital corpsman. Appreciate your coming today.
You bet.
You had mentioned the triple option for analgesia, and you had said fentanyl lozenges and ketamine. What was the third part of that?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. What was the third option?
Yeah, the third option.
Okay, so we talked about the tourniquet, the lozenge. Jim, can you help me there? The third option in the TC3?
Oh, you said ketamine and fentanyl.
Ketamine, yeah,
oh, okay.
ketamine, yeah.
Oh, and the tourniquet has something to do with pain management? No.
Yeah, so the pain management piece, and again, I'm a little out of my realm here. What I remember was the medics would take with them the lozenge, which was the big thing, so we didn't have to do intermuscular, IVs, and the ketamine was the second part. Jim, can you answer the third part?
Yeah, when the triple option analgesia, what they did is said, hey, look, IM morphine doesn't really work in the pre-hospital environment. We've proven that over 100 years. Not a great option. And so when they went to triple option, they said, hey, look, we got to use things that work. Number one was ketamine. Number two was fentanyl. And then using narcotics appropriately. So you can use IV morphine, other options, but IM morphine was taken off the list. And so that was the triple option analgesia concept.
You guys do know that sub-Q morphine works pretty well too. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it was a little muddled there. I couldn't hear y'all, but the triple option really was, okay, continue to use the narcotics if you can. If not, you got the lozenge and the ketamine.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
good, thanks. Yes, sir.
Yes, Steve Permit from the AMA board. My understanding is that the combat uniforms now have built into them 8 tourniquets that can be self-administered. Is that correct?
Well, the guys, again, I haven't seen I've been out for 3 years, but I can tell you, when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, the tourniquet's about yay big. Guys will carry multiple tourniquets on their body. Because if you have a helicopter crash or, guys get hit in combat, I mean, on a night op, Rangers, you may have 3 or 4 guys that are wounded, with maybe 1 medic. So guys are all doing it. So yeah, they carry them, but they can put them in a cargo pocket, or they put them on their web gear, easy to carry. And I don't know if the new uniforms actually have them embedded in them or not.
Yeah, that was my understanding, is that the new uniforms actually have 8 of them embedded for each part of the extremities so that they can just crank them up themselves.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, sir.
Chancellor McRaven, thank you very much for a very stimulating and very powerful presentation. You talked a lot about being prepared or optimizing our disaster preparedness now. I'm an anesthesiologist, actually at McGovern Medical School, so one of your institutions. And one thing that you allude to, for example, DARPA's developed a drug delivery device that could actually make drugs for the field, like a portable pharmacy for Afghanistan. You mentioned the auto-injectables that are being developed right now. How does the process work to actually get these great ideas that can actually reduce time to delivery of care in the civilian world, and even not necessarily only in the emergency preparedness realm, but also reduce costs and increase quality of care and increase value of care for the regular civilian world on top of preparing us for disasters? How do we get all that creativity that you've been able to harness in the military with those resources and get that to the civilian world faster?
Yeah.
And please describe that process.
Yeah, I think, again, I'll go back to the point, in war, we have regulations, and we follow the regulations, and certainly when it comes to life or limb, we have to follow them pretty closely. But having said that, in wartime, because it's an all-volunteer service, you will find we're able to spend more on a patient because, frankly, we're not overly concerned. I mean, the docs are concerned. You don't want healthcare costs to outrun the cost of fighting the war, but frankly, cost in general is not a factor. What happens when we are trying to develop, new protocols is the military will put the amount of money into it to develop a new protocol or the TC3 or whatever the device might be. And then once we find out whether or not it actually functions on the battlefield and does well, because again, you hate to say the soldiers are kind of helping beta test it, but if it's going to save lives, you're prepared to do that. And then you can begin to scale it up a little bit. And so it's a little bit, I think, difficult to compare how we would do things in the military in terms of cost saving relative to how you might do things in the civilian world. I think what happens, though, is as we move down this path in the military and we hit a price point that works, I think that's when the kind of cross-pollination occurs. Jim, am I close on that? All right. Yes, sir.
Michael Levine from Galveston, Texas. I'm a psychiatrist, but I was a general medical officer in Vietnam, 1, 3, and 2, 4 BLTs. And I want to give a shout out to military psychiatry. We didn't have a clue what PTSD and acute stress reactions were. We just knocked the guys out, and if they would wake up, we'd give them their M16 back and send them back. And the progress that has been made in recognition and treatment is just astounding, and just a shout out to military behavioral health.
Yeah, thanks. So the comment, thank you. The comment was really on psychiatry and how today's military really is much better, and I think a lot of it has to do with just recognizing, and as you can see, PTSD is not just a function of guys that were always in hard combat. I think anytime you're around kind of trauma for a sustained period of time, there's always something that lingers. I've told that story a number of times, hoping that it will get easier to tell. It never gets easier to tell. But I'll tell you what we have done, and this was, this required, I think, the soldiers, if you will, to excuse the term, but to man up. And one of my command sergeant majors, so the senior enlisted guy in U.S. Special Operations Command, was a Sergeant Major Chris Ferris. And Chris had been a young Delta operator during the famed Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu. He had fought in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in Iraq, Afghanistan. A highly regarded, he had been the Delta Force Command Sergeant Major, so a very, very well-regarded senior enlisted man when he came to work for me initially at my 3-star and then at my 4-star command. But Chris had issues. He had seen a lot of combat in his time. He struggled with depression. He struggled with relationships. He struggled with a lot of things. And he and his wife, God bless him, Lisa, when they came to SOCOM, he said, "Sir, we have got to get the word out that it's okay for these young enlisted guys to say, I got a problem." So he and Lisa really went on a road show to meet with all the enlisted guys across the 70,000 folks I had. And then eventually he started working with the Army and the other services because his story was so powerful. And the point was, it's okay, guys. It is okay to come forward and let people know that you've got issues. We had a number of issues, psychiatric, mental health issues, PTSD issues that manifest themselves on the battlefield in ways that were horrific, because people all of a sudden saw shadows where there weren't shadows, and we had a blue-on-blue incident one time where a young soldier or a soldier killed his very best friend because he thought he was the enemy because he was so terrified, because he had been in constant combat. So we began a very aggressive approach to dealing with PTSD. And every unit that went into the field, before they would come back, we had what we called, I think it was a third location decompression. So instead of taking folks directly from the battlefield back to the continental United States, which we used to do, you could be literally in a fight one night, and 24 hours later, you're back with your wife or girlfriend. And let me tell you, that is not the way to bring people, integrate them back into a common environment. And so we would send them someplace just for a couple days to decompress. But we also would get them with the psych, the doc, the chaplain, and a counselor, and we would do the neck-up checkup, basically. We would say, look, we need to talk to you. How you doing? They would do a physical checkup, they'd do a mental checkup, they would go through all this, and they'd give them a chance to kind of have a beer and chill out before we integrated them back into the home front. So we recognize now in ways that we didn't before the real problems that are existing out there with the force. Not to say all these kids are broken, they're not. They're great young men and women, but we should never, and I think frankly, I'm going to segue off here for a second. All of my docs, and David Lakey is here with me as well, my Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs, we are looking between the presidents at all of the 6 health-related institutions I have, MD Anderson, UT Health here in Houston, and Tyler, and San Antonio, and Southwestern. We are all looking at how do we make sure we are taking care of the caregiver. We understand that physician burnout is one of the key issues affecting physicians around the world. And so we are trying to figure out ways, what did we learn? What did I learn in the military in terms of dealing with burnout of the soldiers who have been in combat for almost 15, 16 years? How will that apply to the physician and the nurse and the caregiver that has to do the same thing? What do we need to do in order to improve our quality of life for the physicians? So you should know that UT System's taking that on head first. That was a long answer to your question, but there's a lot going on in that field. Yes, sir.
Admiral, hi. I'm John Scott. I'm an anesthesiologist from Dallas-Fort Worth. I was in the Army for 9 years. I appreciate your speech today. It was impressive. My question is all of a sudden the physicians have been attacked or having to take on a battle with, I guess part of it being the VA, because now we have a nurse that is the Surgeon General, or the General of the, as far as in the VA. So how can we, as physicians, take care of this? And I understand with what you said today, you get it. And so what are we supposed to do when all of a sudden we're being attacked and we're trying to take care of patients, but yet we're having to be in Austin and in Washington, D.C. trying to defend our patients? I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think I'd have to see all the various issues that you're having to deal with. But I tell you, this has got to be a kind of a constant dialogue, I think, between the Texas Medical Association, the physicians are at large, with whoever is setting policy. We talked early on about the policy and how TMA is trying to influence the policy at the Capitol. I think you need to continue to make your case. But I will tell you, I want to go back to this, the discussion about my presidents, because it was very enlightening for me. One of the very first retreats we had that I attended, maybe it was the second retreat, we used to hold the retreats in a very kind of sterile environment, and we would, kind of the presidents would come in one day and we'd have this discussion, we'd have briefs and all this sort of stuff. And I said, what I'd like to do is I need to get to know these guys, so we're going to start off someplace not in the AT&T Center, and we'll meet the night before, and we're going to have drinks in the bar. And I want to talk through issues where we're not looking at PowerPoint slides. And it was interesting, those discussions in the bar before the formal event the next day were probably the most productive of any discussions we had. But my takeaway from these presidents that run these very large, multi-billion dollar enterprises is that they are still docs, that they care about their patients. And that came through loud and clear. We weren't talking about the margin. We were talking about the mission of MD Anderson and UT Health and Health Science Center San Antonio and the medical schools. We were talking about patient care. And when you talk about patient care, from docs that are passionate. It's really hard to fight that argument. Yes, sir.
Ken Maddox, trauma surgeon, Houston. Thank you, sir, for being a Texan.
My pleasure.
If we look to our right, to our left, in front of us and behind us, the intellectual and experience property in this room is awesome. We don't have to go to Rand. We don't have to go to Hartford. I suggest for us to think together in the positions of authority that are in this room to create a think tank in Texas that consolidates this experience, this vision, this challenge that overcomes the political arena and has a practical approach to what we do to the challenges you reiterated. And the time to start that is today.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, one of the things that I challenged my staff as we began to build our strategic plan, and it is right along those lines. I said, you know, we tend to, in the areas of national security and health care and pick something, I said, I want people to start asking, what does Texas think? You know, what does Texas think on the national security side about terrorism, about immigration, about health? What does Texas think? Stop asking what Harvard thinks and Stanford thinks. Ask if you want, but ask what Texas thinks. So this was kind of a theme of where we wanted to go. And again, I'm sure there is no greater talent than the talent that's in this room today, but I will tell you, I think it's true of a lot of other areas across Texas. Again, when I look at UTMB, I talk about, you know, when we look at the medical branch at Galveston, with one of the few, you know, level 4 biosafety labs, and you look at the work they're doing on Zika and Ebola and all the other, there is no other institution like that, you know, maybe one or two others in the entire nation. So if you're worried about a pandemic, come to Texas. Ask us what we think. You want to know about border and immigration issues? Go talk to the folks at El Paso, UT El Paso, or UT Rio Grande Valley. So we need to ask, everybody out there needs to understand this has become an intellectual center for a whole lot of issues. Certainly medicine and caregiving ought to be at the top of that list. Well, thank you all very, very much. I enjoyed being here today. Thanks very much.